The Korean War. Part 1. The War of Movement. Prologue to a Tragedy. The Seeds of Division. The Korean Peninsula, a land with thousands of years of rich history, endured the brutal colonial rule of the Japanese Empire for nearly half a century. Those years left a scar that would never heal in the national psyche. A period when culture was suppressed, resources were plundered, and human dignity was trampled. The burning desire for independence flared in the hearts of every Korean, and they saw a glimmer of hope as the Second World War drew to a close. Previously, Japan, intoxicated by its victories in the wars against the Qing dynasty, 1894 to 1895, and the Russian Empire, 1904 to 1905, had succeeded in eliminating the influence of other nations, establishing its own control over the peninsula. In August 1910, a dark chapter of history began as Korea was formally annexed by Japan, becoming a colony. In August 1945, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki put an end to the ambitions of the Japanese Empire and the Axis powers. Across Korea, people rejoiced in the euphoria of liberation. But that joy was short-lived. Their fate, once again, was decided by distant powers at a conference in Yalta, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill mapped out the new post-war world order. According to the fateful decision of the conference, Korea was to be temporarily divided into two zones at the 38th parallel. The north would be occupied by the Soviet Army, while the south would be under the control of the American military. The 38th parallel, an inanimate line on a map, suddenly became a line of destiny, splitting millions of families, dividing a nation, and sowing the seeds for a future fratricidal conflict. In December 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union came together, agreeing to manage Korea under a joint commission. They promised that Korea would become independent after 5 years of international trusteeship. But that promise was an illusion. The Cold War had already begun to cast its dark shadow over the globe. On the Korean Peninsula, the confrontation between two ideologies, capitalism and communism, grew more intense than ever. The US and the USSR each wanted to install a government friendly to them, a government that would serve their strategic interests in the region. The establishment of a unified government for the entire country met with countless difficulties and ultimately failed completely. Disagreements and mutual suspicion led to an irreparable deadlock. The dream of a unified and independent Korea was shattered. The inevitable result was the formation of two separate governments with opposing ideologies in the two zones. In the south, with strong backing from the US, the politician Syngman Rhee, a staunchly anti-communist nationalist, established the Republic of Korea, ROK, on August 15, 1948. In the north, responding to this development, a parliamentary election was quickly held. In September 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was declared. Led by Kim Il-sung, an anti-Japanese resistance hero and a communist supported by the Soviet Union. In December 1948, the Soviet Union announced its withdrawal from North Korea, a move intended to show respect for its sovereignty. The US took similar action, and by June 1949, only a 500-man military advisory group remained in South Korea. But these withdrawals did not ease tensions. On the contrary, they deepened the division. A temporary military demarcation line had become an impassable border, severing the Korean peninsula into two independent, hostile nations. The embers of conflict had been smoldering long before the official war broke out. As early as April 1948, Even before the Southern government was formed, the Jeju Uprising erupted. Guerrilla fighters from the South Korean Labor Party, a sister party to the Workers' Party of Korea in the north, rose up against the impending administration. The Syngman Rhee government responded with a brutal suppression campaign, turning the paradise island of Jeju into a living hell. Blood was shed. Villages were burned. The result was 30,000 deaths, accounting for about 10% of the island's population, and another 40,000 people fled to Japan as refugees. This massacre was a bloody testament to the political polarization and simmering hatred on the peninsula. Both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee harbored the same ambition: to unify the country under their own flag. They viewed each other as illegitimate regimes. Throughout 1949 and early 1950, small-scale armed clashes constantly erupted along the 38th parallel. The sound of gunfire became a part of daily life. The atmosphere of war grew thicker by the day, waiting only for a spark to ignite a devastating conflagration. The Steel Tempest, the June Invasion. At dawn on June 25, 1950, a quiet Sunday, that spark was lit. Under the cover of heavy artillery, over 130,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army, KPA, surged across the 38th parallel, launching an all-out attack on South Korea. The Korean War had officially begun. The North Korean army was exceptionally well prepared. With 242 Soviet-made T-34 tanks, a weapon the South had no answer for, and about 180 combat aircraft, they possessed overwhelming power. Kim Il-sung's plan was for a blitzkrieg, to shatter the South Korean army, capture Seoul, and force the Syngman Rhee government to surrender before the United States could intervene. On the other side of the line, the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, had about 100,000 soldiers, also trained by the US. However, they were severely under-equipped, with no tanks, no heavy artillery, and a virtually non-existent air force. More importantly, their morale was low, and their loyalty to the Syngman Rhee government, which many viewed as corrupt and authoritarian, was not firm. Within the first few days of combat, the disparity in strength became clear. Facing the storm-like assaults of T-34 tanks and North Korean infantry, the South Korean defense lines crumbled. Entire units retreated in panic, or even deserted en masse to the northern side. Syngman Rhee himself and his high-ranking officials hastily fled the capital, Seoul. On the afternoon of June 28th, just 3 days after launching the attack, North Korean forces entered Seoul, capturing the capital with ease. In their panicked retreat, the South Korean army committed a cruel and futile act. They detonated the bridge over the Han River to halt the enemy's advance, despite thousands of civilians still crowding it to escape. The horrific explosion and the screams of innocent people falling into the cold river became a symbol of the chaos and desperation of the war's early days. This action had little effect. The North Korean army quickly crossed the river and continued its tempestuous advance. By the end of August, they had captured 95% of South Korean territory. The remnants of the South Korean army and the first few American units sent in were pushed into a small corner in the southeast of the peninsula, around the port city of Pusan. This defensive line, known as the Pusan Perimeter, became the last bastion of hope. Kim Il-sung's hope that the Syngman Rhee government would collapse and the country would be unified in a short campaign was close to becoming a reality. But he had underestimated the resolve of the United States and the Western world. The fall of South Korea would have been a resounding victory for the communist bloc in the context of the Cold War, something Washington could not accept. The North's hope for unification vanished into thin air as the United States decided to intervene forcefully in the war. United Nations intervention and the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter. On June 27, 1950, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, with the Soviet representative absent, boycotting the council to protest that China's UN seat was still held by Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China. A resolution was passed calling on member states to provide military assistance to South Korea. The United States, taking the lead, quickly assembled a multinational force under the UN flag. President Harry S. Truman appointed General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific Theater in World War II, and then the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan, as the commander-in-chief of the UN forces. Soldiers and weapons from the US and allied nations began to land at Pusan. All US military forces in the Far East were mobilized, facing ferocious attacks from the North Korean army. The Allied defense line became a battle for survival. The Americans called it the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. However, the North Korean army, after its initial victories, began to show weaknesses. Their supply lines were overextended. They had to fight on a broad front and faced great difficulty in maintaining the supply of ammunition and food. Meanwhile, the air power of the United States began to take effect. The U.S. Air Force, with absolute air superiority, launched thousands of sorties. B-29 bombers flew 40 missions a day, not only targeting North Korean forces at the front, but also causing horrific destruction to cities and infrastructure throughout Korea. Supply depots, oil refineries, and harbors all became targets. This devastation crippled the North Korean logistical system, preventing them from launching the decisive blow needed to breach the Pusan Perimeter. To be continued.